Haley Cavacaro, and I'm currently in Washington, D.C. right now, so I can't do my presentation in person. I hope that you'll accept this video in place of my actual presence. If you have any questions at all during this video, I will be in another state, but my phone will be on. My number is 561-951-3622. So let me begin my presentation on cliteracy. And I guess the first question somebody would ask would be, what is cliteracy? And cliteracy is the assertion that the world is illiterate when it comes to women's bodies, specifically the clitoris. The clitoris, hopefully you all know, is one part of the female sexual system. It's about 9 to 12 centimeters long and 6 centimeters wide. The clitoris rivals the penis in size. Most of the complex organ is actually internal. So what you see on the outside is just the tip. It encompasses 8,000 nerves. And 7 out of 10 women can only orgasm upon receiving direct clitoral stimulation. And we don't really talk about that a lot. And I believe that that leads to a dearth of orgasms among women. 10% of American women will never orgasm in their life. And that's because visual representations of power mainly ignore the clit. We don't see it in cinema, art, advertising, even pornography, which is silly because we see women's bodies sexualized all the time. So why wouldn't we see the organ that is specifically for sexual pleasure? Science has all but overlooked the clit until somewhat recently, and what little we've learned we have yet to adopt medically, socially, or in our education system. So this is Sophia Wallace. She's an artist living in Brooklyn, and recently, this fall, she opened an exhibit, Cliteracy, or 100 Natural Laws, which is the culmination of her work on female sexuality and the purposeful social alienation from the clit. Among her natural laws are orgasm as a human right, the idea that the vagina is not this all-encompassing sex organ, and the focus on the understanding of the female sexual system as a total, so vulva, clitoris. So to begin with, we have to talk about the long-standing fear of sexuality, especially female sexuality. The clit is the only part of the body whose specific and sole function is fun. Female pleasure is not a part of our sexual dialogue. Fallacy. So we commodify sexuality, we add a value to it that will determine the sexuality's haver's worth as a woman. We see this most especially in the propagation of the purity myth. My comrades are going to discuss this more. It places the virgin as the most valued of people, but leaves her worth paradoxically in her potential as a sexual partner. And the only sexuality that we do see encouraged is phallus-oriented. There's also an extreme taboo surrounding female bodies. So we classify them as inherently diseased. This, to me, I think is most obvious when looking at basically any mainstream Western porn site. You see vulvas that more resemble children's than an unshaved vulva, which is put in a fringe category. The classic way to subjugate a body is to define it as other and to make its uniqueness and inferiority. You're more likely to see sexualized image of a woman getting choked or slapped, ejaculated on, than to see a man stimulating a woman's clit until she has a genuine orgasm in any mainstream porn film. It seems that any magazine geared towards females, be it Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, even 17 magazine, that features an advice column will at least occasionally answer a letter asking for help about achieving the female orgasm. Take this answer from Cosmo's website, and let's keep in mind, Cosmo is arguably the premier women's magazine. It definitely dominates the global north, and thus our culture's understanding about what sexuality is. And they say that if you don't think that you've reached what they refer to as the big O, because God forbid somebody would say orgasm, it's probably because, they say, you haven't. This is a predominant narrative that was personally harmful to me during the construction of my own sexuality, particularly because of how unhelpful it is. How is our oversexed but under-orgasmed masses supposed to understand how to achieve pleasure when, instead of practical advice about the clitoris as the dominant sexual organism, we're instead told to watch out for contractions in your vagina? When one woman writes in to solve her problem of her boyfriend, who believes sex is always about his orgasm, the guy guru, Jonathan Small, answers, "He's taking control of his pleasure, why don't you take control of yours?" But it's so difficult to take control of one's pleasure when the act itself isn't what gives the majority of women an orgasm. In fact, this advice giver doesn't even mention the clitoris, which isn't that surprising. The American Civil Liberties Union did a study of New York State's public schools. Nearly across the board, definitions of reproductive organs and genitalia reinforce harmful gender stereotypes and often exclude material that would be relevant to students who engage in sexual activity other than penis and vagina sex. Nearly 1/3 of districts include at least one definition of female anatomy that references male anatomy or bodily fluids, penis and vagina sex, or pregnancy and childbirth. Many include medically accurate definitions along with problematic ones. For example, one district used the definition sperm deposit instead of the word vagina. A textbook used in at least 5 districts defines the vagina simply as the organ that receives sperm during reproduction. Male anatomy is sometimes described using non-medical definitions, though far less. Sometimes the diagrams depict a disembodied uterus, fallopian tubes, and ovaries. Other times they show a woman's body with internal reproductive organs and no external genital features. Only a handful depict the female bladder and urethra, while generally all of the images depicted the male counterparts. The clitoris was mentioned, though not necessarily defined or diagrammed, in a little more than half of the districts. Sexual pleasure is rarely discussed in sex education or health class, except in the context of resisting sexual urges. 17 of the districts that responded to the ACLU's request, which is 20%, did not discuss orgasm or sexual pleasure at all. 56% of the districts included discussion of male orgasm, but not the female orgasm. 56! Just 17 districts, which were 20%, covered sexual excitement, orgasm, or arousal for both men and women. In schools, we'll teach about the vagina like it's analogous to the penis, and not talk about the vulva, the clitoris, other parts of the female sexual system that in fact make sex a lot more pleasurable for most women. It's a real problem, which is lack of orgasms for women. Furthermore, young girls are taught that sex is supposed to hurt. How is a woman supposed to stand up for herself if she's lying about having bad sex? Sophia Wallace identifies another problem as the fetishization of reproductive sex. In the August 2011 issue of Cosmo, which was your assigned reading, Never Lose Your Orgasm Again attributes the phenomena of female sexual frustration to a threefold problem. The first tells women to be thoughtless. This plays into the trope that women are nagging, and it is their own fault that they're too distracted by concerns such as looking fat at this angle to come. The author then continues to tell women to describe exactly what's going on, how he feels inside of you, how hot it is when he does X, Y, and Z. Again, this assumption is your orgasm is coming from vaginal penetration. Finally, she tells you to train your dude by stroking his ego and getting your grand finale. That's what we call killing 2 birds with 1 stone. In this manual for heterosexual relationships, it's of equal importance for females to experience her pleasure as it is for that pleasure to be specifically provided by a male, specifically the phallus, which in many cases is an unrealistic goal. The focus here is specifically on heterosexual sex, where the female half of the duo is supposed to get all of her stimulation solely from the vaginal walls, which is a bit like using Magikarp when you have 5 Gyarados in your Poke Belt, and it'll guarantee that 7 out of 10 women will never achieve an orgasm. So the solution she calls for here is queer sex. She says by ignoring the clit, we've lost our fundamental right to orgasm. The classic narrative of penetrative sex and Freud's vaginal orgasm shall deny American women good sex no longer. Normal human sexuality is merely a masquerade constructed off a narrow view of male heterosexual perspective, which perpetuates the patriarchy. To maintain its power, it demonizes anybody on the margins. We know that sex is most pathologized when it's practiced by the marginalized, the queer, the people of color, poor, unmarried, sex workers, etc. Sophia Wallace calls for more sexual entitlement and a realization that for most people, sexual fulfillment lies beyond the vagina, in the clit, probably with queer sex. The theoretical implications of this are numerous. Sophia Wallace is a third-wave feminist in that her work has multicultural roots. It's informed by her own queer, American, global north, white experiences. She's also a third-wave feminist in that she's concerned with how we act out our private lives in the private sphere. The personal to her is very much political. I would be hesitant, however, to totally categorize her with the third wavers we studied in class. No one here is using the master's tools. I would argue that she's more of a radical cultural feminist for the internet age. Her focus here is on images, and the images we consume and internalize, and specifically how we act them out in our own lives. Her feminist foremothers are people like Anne Colt, who wrote The Myth of the Vaginal Orgasm in the 1970s. Just like these radical cultural feminists, Sophia Wallace sees female sexuality as distinct, erased, and she believes the solution is queer sex as a political act. We can dismantle oppressive structures through private pleasure.